Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar all about conflict on campus. I am Dr. Mike Talbot, and I'm the founder of UK Mediation, here based in Derbyshire with branches in London and Ireland, and ready to tell you about our unique approach to conflict and mediation, and especially how this applies to conflict on campus. A very quick word about myself. I'm a psychotherapist by trade and started UK Mediation 22 years ago now, thinking about the psychology of conflict, what goes on in conflict, what underlies the processes of conflict, and particularly why it's so difficult to resolve, and what we need from an impartial third party such as a mediator if we're going to get external help to resolve our disputes. Today we're talking about the kind of disputes that might occur in the higher education setting. So what kind of conflict do we get? What sort of things come up, and then thinking about how we can apply mediation in that setting. So what is all that about, and where mediation fits in with processes, other processes that may be at play in the higher education setting, the areas in which mediation gets used within higher education, and how you might go about implementing it. So this is what we're going to be talking about this afternoon for around about 40 minutes. There is the chat box within YouTube that you're welcome to comment or ask questions of me as we go along. Please don't be shy. It's good if we can make these events a bit more interactive. So if there's something you want to ask or something you'd like me to zoom in on or particularly spend a bit more time on, you're very welcome to use the chat box to pop your question or comment in there, and I'll do my best to deal with it. I'll also leave a bit of time at the end for questions and answers, so that we can make sure that everybody leaves with a better insight into what's going on with regard to conflict in the higher education setting, which is what we're all about today, conflict on campus. So first of all, let's have a look at the size of the challenge. So in terms of all the sorts of conflict we might get within the higher education setting involving students and staff, whoever falls out with whom, let's have a look at some of the figures. So first of all, here's a recent figure from Save the Student about problems that students have with their accommodation. This might be with the landlord or landlady, but also can be with neighbours, and sometimes can be with people they're sharing with. So it might be in halls where you've got some issues with the other people within your hall, might be in a shared house, might be to do with when you're renting properties, problems with the housing provider. So that's a very, very high figure, over 90% of people getting some kind of problem with their accommodation. Then we have, moving on in terms of still students, but students making complaints. Not surprisingly, the number of complaints is up recently. We've had all the controversy through COVID about students complaining they're not getting value for money, that they've spent their student loan, £9,000 a year usually, on a degree, and not had any contact with face-to-face contact with anybody at the university at all. I do feel sorry for first years in particular, started their degree in September, October 2020, and have had not a great experience of it really. So there have been a bit of an uptick, has been an uptick in the number of complaints. So in 2020, according to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, the OIA, who I will mention later as well, they've received over 2,500 complaints. And those are the ones that have gone up to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, so they haven't been able to get resolved internally. I'll mention again the process by which complaints get resolved within universities, but one of the things about that is that the OIA only gets them when the university hasn't managed to bring them to a successful resolution. Let's have a think about staff as well, so not just the student issues, both with accommodation and other students, and also with the complaints figure there that we've got on screen right now. But thinking about staff within higher education as well, the figure of 13% has been generated by the reference you see down there a few years ago now, but this number of people say that their work relationships are always strained. Always is a very long time. So if that many people, what's that, about 1 in 7, 1 in 8 people of higher education staff say that their work relationships are always strained. That's quite a high figure. And then we're thinking about other issues to do with staff, and another figure that's here, more recent figure from Unite and Unison and the University of Cambridge to say that more than 1 in 5 of the University of Cambridge staff report being subjected to bullying or harassment. That is a very high figure. That was anonymous reporting over the course of the last year or so in terms of the experience of the staff at that university. That's over 1 in 5 people will report that they've been subjected to bullying or harassment. That's quite high. So we're looking there at different aspects of conflict in higher education just to get a sense about the size of the problem. So we've got issues between students, we've got issues with students and the university that they've enrolled for and potentially, you know, turning into complaints. And then we've got issues to do with staff disputes as well, particularly around grievance type issues or bullying and harassment type issues. So those are the figures. Let's have a think about this mediation thing. Many of you on today. It's great to see so many people on from the UK and from around the world to join us today. So you may well have had experiences of mediation. I see there's a couple of people that we've actually trained as mediators. You're very welcome here today. So some people will already know this, but let's have a think about what mediation is. So mediation process is where we get somebody involved as an impartial third party to help a dialogue to happen and hopefully to reach a resolution to all sorts of conflict, which might be between students in university, or perhaps around a complaint scenario, or it might be a staff issue, a grievance type issue. So that mediator is impartial. He or she uses a staged process to make a conversation happen between the two parties and to keep order in that conversation, to keep it constructive and future focused, to the point where the parties have a dialogue, they build that dialogue and can negotiate and exchange their experiences of the other party, their different narratives about what's gone on, their different sets of aspirations and hopes and fears about what could happen with that relationship with the other person or with the situation they find themselves in, and helps people to get to the point where they come up with their own preferred solution to the dispute, complaint, grievance type issue, fallout with another student, problem they've got with the university, whatever it is. So it's about empowering parties to exercise some self-determination in this process of resolving their conflict, get a good dialogue going, get people talking, as we say, and to come up with their own preferred solutions. So what this means is that the mediator is there to catalyse that conversation, make sure the conversation happens in a fair and constructive way, and refrains from solution giving themselves. So we're not there as mediators to tell people what they've got to do or to adjudicate or to come up with our own answer for what should happen, but to set the conditions by which people can come up with their own solutions. So this is what the model is in mediation. And the people who are involved in mediation, they have to agree to participate. So we have to have a voluntary process here. We need to ensure it's not just a free-for-all with the parties having volunteered to take part. So they do need to abide by some ground rules within the mediation, and also some expectations that might be agreed, negotiated with the mediator, such as, for example, that they are open and honest with each other. So we're hoping that people do actually speak frankly and candidly and say what's really on their mind, report their real experience about what's gone on here, and that way we can get to the heart of the matter and make sure that the the process is constructive, it's useful, it's forward moving, it's future focused. Comment of Claire. Hiya Claire, how are you doing? Bullying and harassment figures for Cambridge. Yeah, I'll get my colleague to pull out the link for it so we can get a bit more detail about that. As I understand it, Claire, it's about managers and subordinates, so or colleagues on a level as well. So, but we can definitely, we'll pop the link up if we've got it, and you're welcome to enjoy looking at the detail of that, Claire. Thanks very much for your comment. So the people involved here, this is what we expect in mediation. Ground rules, voluntary participation, and an expectation they will speak openly and honestly with each other. So in terms of the kind of conflict we saw earlier on with those figures, we can think about, where does mediation fit in? How can we see a place for mediation within other dispute resolution processes, and where does it square up with other types of conflict resolution? So there are many and our experience is that people tend to be less familiar with mediation, more familiar with some of the other ways of solving disputes. So I think it's a useful exercise to just pause and have a think about where mediation fits in with and aligns with other dispute resolution processes. So these different types of conflict resolution. The most common one, and the one that people should use if they get a possibly can, is about negotiation between two or more people who have a conversation for themselves. They don't need support, they're perfectly willing and able to have a conversation. They sort it out between themselves. So here's an example. I'll give you an example of all of these as we go along. A little bit wordy, but from a real example this is. We've changed the names obviously and any identifying details with all of these examples, but here's a second year student who moved into private accommodation with her course mate and good friend Neve. And they get on great together and they've had a good time in the first year. The two of them met when they first came to the university in Freshers Week and decided they would move into private rented accommodation together. What they didn't realise, or what Emily didn't realise, that Neve's overall cleanliness is not great. From Neve's point of view, Emily's on her back a little bit, moaning about her personal habits, especially in terms of not taking the bin out, leaving rubbish lying around in the communal areas and leaving out-of-date food in the fridge. She tends to leave half a meal to come back to later and never gets around to it. So Emily thinks the mature approach here, the sensible approach, is to have a chat with her. Takes her aside, quiet word, doesn't do it in front of the other housemates for fear of embarrassing Neve. They figure it out between themselves, exchange their thoughts and feelings about what's going on, have a chat and sort it out through a very simple negotiation. A lot of things can be solved through negotiation. A lot of staff disputes, a lot of complaint scenarios, a lot of student issues can be solved through negotiation. Where we need something more than that is where parties are either not willing or competent to negotiate. Sometimes when it's gone on too long, or when it's just not the right kind of dispute for negotiation, it needs to involve a third party. And this would be the second example where we think about arbitration. What I mean here is arbitration with a small a, or soft arbitration as it's been called. So not sort of formalised arbitration subject to the Arbitration Act with a lot of representatives and advocates and rules of evidence, etc., etc. Nothing like that, but just really an expert determining how a dispute should be ended. So this happens a lot within the higher education setting, where a problem or challenge or conflict is brought to someone else in order that they can tell you, well, okay, here's what needs to happen. It's quite close to conciliation, by the way, so somewhere around this area is the process of conciliation as well. So we're able to define it in terms of expert determination, somebody looking at two sides of an argument and saying here's what needs to happen. So a little example here is where a third year student, we're calling them Asher, last year got an extension to do with circumstances around COVID for his dissertation project. And just before the deadline he had to self-isolate because one of his housemates tested positive. So he actually went back to his parents and again there's nothing identifying here, everything's been changed because of the need to self-isolate, and missed the hand-in deadline as a consequence by just under an hour. It was supposed to have been in at 2 p.m. and he didn't get it in until 3, so he lost 5%, which is the normal practice for a late submission. So unfortunately that meant he went down from what would have been a 2-1 piece of work down to a 2-2. And this has given him some concerns about his final degree classification. So he felt it was a bit harsh, did Asher. He appealed the mark and it was dealt with within the department, but then the registry got involved, spoke to the person in the department, spoke to Asher himself, and in the process then still ongoing of deciding what should be the best outcome to this. Should they be harsh and stick to the rules and say no, it's all the same for everybody, and that if you get your work in late you do lose 5%, that's the way it goes, or should they be lenient in this case given the unusual circumstances. So an arbiter looks at that, an arbiter applies some notion of what's fair and reasonable. The arbiter also has to look at precedents, how have these kinds of disputes been dealt with before, and also looks at what the rules say, what are the limits of what can be allowed within the university, what's the limit of leniency or flexibility around these rules. So that's what an arbiter does. Let's think about this other type of conflict resolution, which is again probably more familiar to a lot of people than mediation, which is about litigation and enforcement. This is basically when the rights and wrongs of a situation are tested in a very win-lose or evidential manner. So we're looking at people making a point, stating a case, looking at usually in the balance of probabilities, who's right and who's wrong, who's got a point and who hasn't. And the kind of thing we might be talking about here could involve an issue to do with somebody's annual leave. So here's a case where an admin officer, he was of the view that he was allowed to carry over some leave that he'd been unable to take, wanted to carry it over into the new academic year, and was of an understanding, and says that it was in a minuted meeting of which he himself has some notes, that people were being allowed to carry leave over because of the difficulties last year, folks not being able to go on holiday or actually use their leave. University claims this is not the case and has never been the case, and as far as the ruling goes, he's lost his annual leave because he didn't take it. Pretty unhappy, he put in a grievance, it was not upheld, he's about to appeal that, and he's also thinking of taking the matter to a tribunal. So here is a case of whether the rules have been followed or not followed. Have the rules been followed or not in terms of looking at the evidence on both sides? So was there a minuted meeting in which this was a variation to the contract? Was he told this is a variation to his employment contract for this year? Was, if such a ruling existed, was it applied fairly and reasonably across the board? So we're into this kind of language and this kind of an environment where you're looking at enforcing the rules, litigating, deciding if something's right or wrong, should be allowed or not allowed, and it's very much about a win-lose sort of process. So we may find at the end of this that James either does or doesn't get his leave, and of course, being very large employers, higher education institutions, they've got to be careful about setting precedent and making sure that this guy is afforded his employment rights and an outcome that's consistent with what it says in his employment contract. Employment tribunal's been mentioned, and there's another set of processes there when we get to the tribunal. So that's all those, just to give some context, and then we can think about, okay, back to where we are with mediation and where it fits in. So this is, as we've said, it's where an impartial third party gets the conversation going and sets up the right environment to get people talking, to promote dialogue, to help people to exercise that sort of self-determination to come up with their own solution to a range of disputes or complaints scenarios. So what kind of examples would this work with? Well, I think most of the above, really. So we have we make a distinction here at UK Mediation about different types of mediation, three sorts of mediation really. So there's family mediation for divorce and separation, which we don't do. And then there are two forms of mediation that we do, which is, as we call them, interpersonal mediation and commercial mediation, which are loose classifications for, in the first case, disputes where there might be student-student conflicts in the context we're talking about today, student-staff complaints, or staff-staff disputes like grievance-type issues, allegations of bullying and harassment. And then the other one, the commercial mediation, is ideal for employment disputes. They're not quite the same, and in commercial mediation we have a slightly different model where people would have representatives and advisors, and it's very much more to do with avoiding going to court or to the employment tribunal. So that would be the case in the annual leave example with James. We're trying to head off a tribunal. And it's about people being afforded their legal rights at the same time, coming up with a pragmatic commercial solution to something that would otherwise get litigated. Whereas the interpersonal mediation, which I'll concentrate more on, is about looking at people into an interpersonal conflict involving a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication, a problem with communication style, something that one party is alleged to have done or said that has caused distress to the other one, or simply a personality clash or a problem with management style. So interpersonal mediation will apply to most of the things we've mentioned so far, especially the student-student conflicts, especially student-staff complaints, as we've seen, and especially staff-staff disputes. So that is really fairly and squarely where interpersonal mediation really fits in, and we still have commercial mediation for the other stuff, which is what we would describe as employment disputes. That's where mediation fits in. And so what is it? How does it work? what is it going to let people do? The link there, Claire Anderson, is in the chat box if anybody else wants to take a look at that article about Cambridge University. It was in the Guardian Education. It was actually leaked to the Guardian apparently, according to my colleague, so thanks very much, Scott, for popping that up there. So that's available in the chat box. Anybody wants to look up that Cambridge University report. How does mediation work? Well, what it does is it allows the parties, first of all, who are perhaps feeling fed up with each other, angry with each other, a bit annoyed with one another's conduct as they see it, fed up with what the other person said or did to them or how they treated them. It allows that tension to be released a little bit. And I think one of the things that we acknowledge very quickly about the psychology of conflict is it's very hard to think straight when you're feeling furious with somebody. So once your rationality gets clouded with a sense of anger or frustration or disappointment or sadness even, it's very hard to think straight. And I think one of the first things we're doing in mediation is partly building rapport with individuals so that they can firstly offload to the mediator in private and then potentially have a fairly offloading conversation with the other party when we get them together in the presence of the mediator. So one thing we're doing in mediation is releasing that tension, diffusing that sort of anger and frustration in a non-damaging way so nobody gets wiped out, but just so we get to the point where people, you know, are ready to start to have some kind of a dialogue. And importantly, when we're looking at building that interpersonal bridge between the two parties, what happens is they get to understand the impact of their own words and actions on the other person, and they get to tell the other person what is the impact of that other person's words and actions. So part of the way we build that interpersonal bridge is by them exchanging their experiences of what the other person has said and done. Here's how I've been affected, and also getting a chance to do that reciprocally. That's one of the ways the mediation works, or our model around mediation. And I appreciate there are slightly different models here and people do these things in different ways, but for interpersonal disputes, this is where we're at, very much about looking at that dialogue building type approach to conflict resolution. So here's where we get to in mediation, is that more constructive and more future focused exchange of their different views. There is an element of catharsis or discharge in here, so they get to release that tension and speak about how they've been affected. And where we get to then is about talking about what are we going to do from now on so that we can resolve this dispute, number one, and stop it happening again, number two. So we are mostly interested in bringing the current situation to a resolution and ensuring that it doesn't reoccur. So I think that's an important thing about mediation when we look at it vis-a-vis those other dispute resolution processes, is this is very much about future-proofing the working relationship. So if students have to live together, we can resolve the stuff about the food in the fridge and the late night noise and never taking the bin out and leaving your dirty worktops full of old washing up and so on. Yes, we can resolve that for now, but importantly it's about getting an understanding of how are we going to avoid this happening again in the future. And various things arise from mediations in that setting, for example a cleaning up rota, or a taking the bin out rota, or a rule that if food is in the fridge for more than 3 days it gets thrown out, or making sure you put your name on things. So a lot of stuff about that, but getting a better understanding of each other at a more heartfelt level, so that people know what one another needs and can be sure that they avoid coming into conflict with them again over the same issues in the future. So that's what the future focused dialogue is all about. And one of the ways that we come up with these shared resolutions for what we're going to do differently is through this process of reframing. So we're just taking the lid a little bit off some of what happens in mediation. So reframing is a process or a skill that's used by mediators when we're coming up with shared resolutions within the context of the dialogue that gets built within mediation. So what we tend to do when, I say we, people who come into conflict, which might be me or anybody on the webinar today, or any number of students or staff or people in higher education, what we tend to do is just naturally, if we fall out with somebody or have a big bust up with them, is we tend to attribute blame and fault to the other party. You know, it was they who did it, they're wrong. And we don't like, particularly when we're angry with the other person, to go to that more vulnerable place where we're saying, well, fair dues, you know, it was all my fault, I'm to blame. sorry, mea culpa, you know, what can I do? So what we tend to do is to at least partially blame the other person. And in the process of mediation, what the mediator's language and demeanour and the process guides us towards, or brings us to a more acceptable place of being able to see that actually there's a shared responsibility for making this situation better. Mediators are not about saying, well, it's mostly this guy's fault or mostly that guy's fault. It wouldn't be helpful at all. What we can do is try and engender this sense of shared responsibility through the process, through our language, through the way that we frame the dialogue within the mediation, so that instead of trying to attribute blame and fault to each other, the parties take on this idea that they've got a shared responsibility to make it better. The other thing I think we do in conflict situations when we're fed up, angry, annoyed, frustrated with another party is we tend to try and reinforce our own position by talking mostly about past events. So I will point the finger at the other guy and say, yeah, but what about the other week when you did this? And what about last week when you left that porridge in the fridge for a fortnight? And how about when the bin was so spilling over that I had to step over the rubbish in the kitchen? Or if it was a grievance type issue, you know, it might be, well, what about that time when you screamed at me in a meeting when we were on a Zoom and I couldn't get a word in because you were talking over me every single time? So we will tend to bring up past events and use history to try and reinforce our position or our own narrative about what's gone on. And what we need to do in mediation is to allow that to happen to an extent and reframe, so that where we can get to is a place that we have a better narrative about what future actions are going to be. So we move from the two different narratives about the history into a place where they either construct a new narrative between them to come up with a shared narrative about future actions. So people are not necessarily going to agree with one another's versions of the past events. And that's okay, you know, I pretty well accept that as a mediator, that people have got two different stories. They're not going to coincide. They're not necessarily going to agree about what's happened up to this point. But what we can do is help them to get to a place where they feel ready to agree about what should happen from this point onwards. The new shared narrative, the future actions that arise from reframing to get away from the past events. And I think the third thing that we do when we're looking at reframing, the third thing we tend to do in conflict is we tend to get a bit insistent about what's got to happen. So we will tend to bang on the desk or stamp our feet and say, no, here's what's got to happen. You're going to do this, you're going to do that, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And when the two parties do that jointly, we can end up in a bit of a standoff, the kind of thing that would often be seen within litigation, within tribunals or at court, is you get into that very positional standoff between the two disputing parties. We want to avoid that as mediators, so we try and get away from people's positions, which is their insistences, their demands that they're making of each other, away from the positions, and more start to talk about people's underlying needs, about their interests, as we call it in mediation. What is it that this person really wants? What are their wishes? What are their aspirations? What are they being deprived of in their worldview by the other person's words and actions? So quite often in conflict, when we think about the psychology of conflict, the reason that people are in dispute is that they see the other person as depriving them of something that's important to them. So as mediators, what we want to do is get away from these positional insistences, these demands and very concrete sort of assertions that people make, and rather get into what need is being compromised here, what is the interest of each party, how can we have the dialogue to make sure that both parties get their interests satisfied as a result of a better conversation. So that's what we're talking about with reframing, just to take the lid off that little bit of mediation. This is one of the things that's at the heart of it. A lot more to it, of course, but that's one little element. Okay, so let's move it on a little bit. Think about the kind of disputes that mediation can resolve. I talked about applying it in the student-student area, applying it in the staff-student area, and also applying it in staff-staff disputes, grievance-type issues, workplace-type issues. Now let's think of a couple of examples then. So student-student disputes might come up within, and this is an interesting one, which when we started doing this work with higher education institutions over 20 years ago, hadn't quite occurred to us, but this happens quite a lot. Issues within work groups. What happens is that students are required, sometimes I wouldn't say not for the first time, because quite often in sixth form people are expected to work in work groups, but some 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds are not great at this. Working in a group of 5 or 6 to produce a piece of output, a project or a report or an essay or some kind of empirical work together, having to cooperate with others, having to give and take a little bit, delegate, share work out, work to time scales. Some people aren't great at it. So you do get conflict of students working together in work groups. Accommodation issues, which I've mentioned already, which are the kinds of things, you know, it's often to do with noise or mess or people not pulling their weight within the flat. But the other thing is between students and the housing providers, landlords and landladies, and sometimes between the agencies that sit in between the landlords and landladies and the student tenant. So all that stuff. But the other one is noise in accommodation, which is where you've got second years in a shared house with you know, who might be a bit noisier than perhaps some of the other people in the shared house who are in their final year, about to, you know, coming up to exams or having to get their dissertation written. And in halls of residence as well, you can get postgrads on the same sites as you know, first years. So the first years are away from home for the first time. They're letting rip a bit, disturbing the postgrads or disturbing people who are further on in their journey, educational journey, and you can get quite a bit of conflict about that as well. The other thing is about fallouts from relationships. Thank you, social media. So all sorts of problems that we come across in higher education where there have been issues that have been magnified because of being in or not being in a particular WhatsApp group, or things that get said on Facebook, or who you don't include or who you exclude from seeing your content. All sorts of issues of relationship problems being exacerbated by what people say and do on social media. But of course, you know, the usual stuff about people's relationships ending and the kind of fallout that that can cause. And then allegations of bullying and harassment, quite a serious one really, within, again, exacerbated by social media, ganging up basically, often around issues of difference, but not always. But sometimes people ganging up on others, excluding them from the social group, you know, saying pretty bad things about one another. We've been involved in some fairly tricky team disputes where there are allegations of students bullying and harassing other students, either in groups or individually. Quite serious stuff there. So mediation works very, very well for all of this. What we always recommend is try mediation first. So if parties have not been able to negotiate their way through a conflict, as I mentioned earlier, negotiation is perhaps the default method, and they need a bit of help to have that conversation. That's when the mediator gets involved. And it can be for all of these things, and is highly effective in our experience. Next one is the student-staff disputes. So students might have complaints around teaching quality, some criticisms of the tutors or supervisors, perceived lack of support, particularly with postgrads. A frequent complaint is of postgrads, PhD students, etc., not being able to get enough access to their supervisor, not getting sufficient support, the supervisor not giving them enough time, choice of supervisor sometimes. It can be for undergrads as well, where there's not enough availability of that tutor to provide the students what they want, particularly being affected over lockdown as well, of course, and online teaching. And the other one is about unwelcome behaviour, which may come in all shapes and forms, but sometimes arising from misunderstandings or people stepping over a boundary with regard to mixing personal and professional relationships. And the last one is around perceptions of unfair treatment, where the student feels as if they are getting treated less considerately or getting less of the tutor's time or supervisor's time than other people. They feel as if their treatment is unfair, and this can sometimes relate to whole groups of students or might just be an individual. So a massive amount we could say about all of those examples. Suffice to say that we have and continue to use mediation very successfully in these areas. And as I'll come on to in a minute, we sometimes train groups of individuals within the university setting to be able themselves to mediate these kinds of disputes. So you can imagine these might be fruitfully addressed by the use of an external mediator, but sometimes it's good to have your internal mediators as well, which I'll come on to in just a second after we mention about staff disputes. So here is a typical workplace mediation type setting. So those of you who are on today who are trained in mediation will know about workplace mediation, and in the HE setting there's no difference. We still get staff disputes, which are grievance type issues, allegations of bullying and harassment, simple breakdown in communication between individuals who might be on a level or might be a manager and a report who fall out, or it can be disputes within teams. You know, it's not unusual at all within the university setting when we get referrals of workplace disputes that it involves a teaching team or a research team or a team in a lab who've fallen out. Could be 4, 5, 6 people. It could be a larger number of people altogether. We've done some quite large numbers in the HE setting. So these are some of the places where mediation can be applied. And I think if we take a look at then, how are we going to introduce mediation into these places? We've worked the last 22 years with a lot of universities up and down the country and some overseas as well. We now have an EU base, and we're just seeing some work getting lined up with a number of universities in mainland Europe as well. In terms of introducing mediation, what we often do is we will give some of the time with one of our external mediators to go into a situation within a university as an independent and impartial mediator who has no connection to the organisation or to the parties. They don't know the mediator, never met them before, probably not going to meet them again. So it's a nice clean sort of relationship of a mediator dropping in, recruited in by often by HR or by senior management, or employee relations within the university, can come from the registry as well actually, to provide this independent and impartial mediation service. So it's on demand, only brought in for one-off cases, usually quite short turnaround time. Typical staff dispute would be a day. Complaint scenarios can be a little bit longer. The student disputes can actually be quite a bit shorter. They're often quite quick to sort out. Very effective. The external mediators on our panel are very experienced. It's a lot of them, that's all they do. So we would send in an external mediator, do it that way. And there are many mediation providers. I'm not talking about just us doing it. You might get your mediator from anywhere at all. The other option is to use your own mediators. So here we are doing ourselves out of business here. So what we would do is say, okay, you don't need our mediators here at UK Mediation. What we'll do is train you up a panel or tranche or cohort of your own mediators. So we would come in and do our accredited training. It's accredited level 4. It's recognised by the International Mediation Institute now, which is something we got post-Brexit. So you have this international recognition, so that you have a panel of mediators within your university who are ready and on hand to resolve disputes. So it's a really handy resource to have within the university. And some of the universities that we first trained panels of mediators up, what we've done over the years is go in and do continued training where they've lost people just due to staff moving on or getting too busy to stay in the mediator role, but to keep a topped up panel of mediators who are on hand ready to resolve disputes. So you can have quite quick turnaround for the referral. The mediators get the university's processes or policies, so they kind of speak the language, and it can be quite cost effective. So once you've reaped the training investment, you then have mediators within the walls of the university, as it were. Particularly helpful if there's a lot of cases, and particularly cost effective because they're salaried members of the university's workforce, but can be called upon or released to provide mediation internally, and you're not doing the pay-as-you-go model as if you had an external mediator coming in. This all works within the context of our own conflict resolution pathway, which is something that we've been working on for a long time, around how we put our services together within some kind of a pathway that ensures informal resolution of disputes. So right from training people how to facilitate conversations, emphasising early and informal resolution to all the types of disputes. So it's a pathway. If you want to get it, it's free to obtain from us. Just drop us an email and we can send this out to you. explaining how you might have internally managers and team leaders who are skilled enough to be able to facilitate conversations between people, whether that's between students or between students and staff around all the kinds of issues I've discussed, or to an extent the staff type issues as well. So getting early and informal resolution to all the sorts of disputes we talked about, having your own people trained up internally, so that negotiation and collaboration are encouraged, and we have this sort of cultural shift in the workplace away from very, adversarial grievance type approaches to resolving disputes, and more into early informal collaborative processes where there is this sense of people collaborating and demonstrating their own sort of self-determination to work on their own working relationships and relationships with and between students. So very much a cultural shift, something we've been promoting for a long time, which we've put together into our conflict resolution pathway, in which people are taking control of their own relationships. We're cutting down this time and expense that we have to spend on formal processes, and really getting the organisation and the people in it more resilient to conflict. So quite a bit more to say about that, but just to sort of pull together what I've been saying to you today, in terms of all the approaches to conflict, how we can get away from this more adversarial, litigious win-lose way of thinking about conflict, and getting more into a place where we're thinking about win-win, thinking about collaboration, we're thinking about much cheaper, quicker, and much more affording people responsibility for their own relationships. Okay, so that's the conflict resolution pathway, pulling a few of those ideas together. We've got a link in the chat box, as well as the link to the piece of research that Claire was asking about. There's also a separate webinar about launching a mediation service. There's a link there you can follow. And if you want to have a look at the few more words about the conflict resolution pathway, there's a link on there as well. So, question from Sophie. Thanks very much. I have a question, says Sophie, about the OIA. Aren't they there for a reason, to resolve disputes? Why would they not be used? Thank you for that, Sophie. So it's an important backstop for the universities is having the OIA, which is the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, who would get involved and adjudicate disputes involving higher education if the university has not managed to solve them. But what universities are keen to do, and I believe there are actually penalties for not doing this, what you're keen to do is to resolve the disputes within the university's own four walls. And I think, to an extent, with greatest respect to the people that work in this area, it can be perceived as a failure if you've not resolved the dispute within the organisation's own processes, and if it has to progress to the OIA, it's generally considered to be a negative mark against the university that they've not managed to solve it for themselves. So a couple of answers there, Sophie. Yes, they are there to resolve disputes, but they'd rather not have to. They would rather have the university do it for themselves, and the university can be penalised if they don't do so. Here's one from Andy. Hi, Andy. As is to be expected, we have a lot of issues with drunken behaviour, stroke antisocial behaviour during Freshers Week. Yeah, there's been a lot written about this in recent years, including to the point of new students getting a briefing from the university, a bit of a talk when they first attend university, saying, here's what behaviour is acceptable, here's what behaviour is not acceptable, and if you are either subject to or witness unacceptable behaviour between youngsters who are often away from home for the first time, perhaps drinking quite a bit for the first time, being amongst a whole load of other people their same age and aspirations, and with so much in common, and having a great time for Freshers Week. Unfortunately, that can trip over into some quite poor behaviour, criminal behaviour in some cases, and there's been a need to address that in quite a formal, quite strict way over the years. Question from Andy, is mediation suitable for this sort of thing? Thanks. Well, you know what, if somebody's broken the law, no. I think there are occasions we've had inquiries about where people, there've been quite serious assaults, sexual assaults. There have been, quite poor behaviour between people, where the most appropriate remedy is to speak to the police, not to a mediator. However, lower level stuff where both parties are minded to have a conversation about it, just to put some boundaries down, just to say to the other person, here's how here's what I think about what you did, or here's what I think about what I allege you did, then mediation is a good space for that. So if it can avoid, particularly, in the first week or two of somebody's university career, if it can avoid going to those litigious stages, particularly police involvement or particularly with sanctions from the university, then it's got to be a good thing. But I would say, there is a line, and there is behaviour that can't be tolerated and has to be sanctioned. It's not something that you can just, have a chat about and it goes away. So I think yes and no is the answer to your question, Andy, as most of my answers to most questions. Alrighty, let's move on. I'm trying to keep within my time limit. So I've got a few webinars to mention for you. One is about building dialogue during difficult times. So we're going to be talking about pandemic and lockdown, and referring specifically to some things that have come up during this difficult period, where mediation comes in, and then coming into October, talking about neighbours. We do this about once a year, this one. So neighbourhood disputes could relate to student-student disputes, of course, they're neighbours, and how we put mediation into that setting. And then something around diversity, culture and conflict in November, culture, conflict and collaboration, about inclusive mediation services, about dealing with cultural issues, how we apply mediation to that. And then the December one, as we often do, as we get close to Christmas and the coldest time of the year, is about homelessness prevention, mediating with families in crisis. So this is about our work and our training work with organisations who do this at the sharp end, working with families at the risk of breakdown to the point where somebody gets made homeless. And that's in December. So there we are. It's just a few minutes over my limit. I'm always trying to get it within this 45 minutes with the questions as well. So that's been Conflict on Campus. Thanks very much for your questions and comments. Thanks for being here today. I look forward to seeing you on our future webinars. Have a great weekend.